let me get on a head start. So this is Schumpeterian growth. You can present many subtitles to this. One subtitle could be the so-called logo, the market value of the Schumpeterian ideology, which is the idea of creative destruction. And I'm going to formalize this idea into an official setting. Another subtitle could be, with a little bit of drama, could be the antecedent, the priors of the Romerian growth. With a slight change in notation, you will realize and appreciate that Romer had picked up almost all of the ideas from the Schumpeter's framework. In exchange, Schumpeter had borrowed a lot of things from Marx, David Ricardo, and Adam Smith, who in turn borrowed things from physiocrats, all the way back to Egyptians and Adam and Eve. That's how science progresses. There is nothing wrong with this, but when we talk about R&D-driven, knowledge-driven endogenous growth, it didn't occur all of a sudden from outside scratch. So put any title you want, priors to Romer, creative destruction, or the main source of the R&D-driven growth model. Let me highlight a couple of the basic messages of this framework. One, we have the premise that innovation is intentional and costly. That is, the parameter that we denoted as A in most of our production technologies, it does not occur by itself. It is an intentional end result of entrepreneurs trying to get benefits, profits, pecuniary returns. Being an idealist, serving for humanity and coming up with ideas is credible. There are numerous examples of this. Great mathematicians, philosophers, technicians who could not reap the gains of their products and died in poverty, including Marx himself. But this is an exception. The ideas had been put into current productive economic use due to intentional activity, and they always had been costly. There is no free lunch. Based on this thing, another premise is these costs of innovation have to be confronted with monopolistic profits, or have to be covered, let's say, rather than confronted. That is, the price system, the market system, in a perfectly competitive setting will fail to deliver enough profits to cover these costs. And you know the basics of this story. It is because knowledge or innovation in general is a public good. Once you invent something, then it is almost free of charge to disseminate it. And these first initial costs have to be covered. And the only way the market system can provide a coverage is through monopolistic profits. Now, the Schumpeterian addition to these two premises is a slight change in the notion of our equilibrium concept. If you will summarize in a Romerian setting, the equilibrium, or one of the equilibrium concepts we are invoking, is the fact that these profits are just barely enough to cover the fixed costs. That is, there is no net gain that had been left to the monopolist. Monopolists make profits, but they use their profits to cover the costs. In Schumpeter, the idea of equilibrium is slightly different, or maybe more than slightly, in that under his conceptualization, each new innovation is associated with the withdrawal of an existing enterprise from the system. Each new A replaces an existing enterprise. That one of the existing enterprises who had not been successful enough to compete with the new innovation drops out of the system. It is destroyed. So each new innovation, that is, each new creation, each new creative activity withdraws an existing enterprise, simply destroys it. So there is a creative destruction. And just like we have assumed in Romer that each new blueprint, let's say A+1, was generating a new intermediate firm and a new intermediate input. And the set of information was expanding this way. You are coming up with ideas. Each new idea is used to set up a new product, while the remaining products remained intact. In contrast, in Schumpeter, each new A creates a new X, but in the meantime destroys a previous X. Let's say X minus 1. In slight dramatization of the events, for example, the rise in Apple, iPhone, Samsung and their innovations is associated with the decline and fall or quote unquote destruction of Nokia, for example. And there are other examples. The innovations in the airline industry, like the Turkish Airlines becoming one of the greatest airlines in the global airfare, is associated with the destruction of Pan Am, for example. Pan Am was the first using the passenger corridor technology, but it had been outmarketed by new innovations. So that under Schumpeter, monopolies cannot persist. Under Romer, you set up a new firm and they are there indefinitely. They are not making net profits. Their profits are going to cover costs, but nevertheless, as monopolies, as enterprises, they remain indefinitely. Under Schumpeter, each new innovation brings up a new product line and it destroys an existing monopolist. So monopolies are not permanent. That's a Schumpeterian task. So creative destruction creates and destroys. So at the outset, quote unquote, the number of enterprises or the number of technologies at present do not expand or do not fall. They remain constant. That is the idea of equilibrium under Schumpeter. In terms of competition, both Romer and Schumpeter, they do not regard competition in price or market terms. Schumpeterian competition is in terms of institutions and new enterprises at the monopolistic enterprise level. Old monopolies try to remain in business. New monopolies try to advance their market behavior. Buyurun.
Can we say that under the Schumpeter world, the only thing which is increased, not the quantity of enterprises, only the quality?
Exactly, exactly. The quantity of number of enterprises and the number of products in line are stable, but the quality improves all the time. There is a qualitative expansion reflected in terms of falling costs. So that's the main idea. Now let's put these things in a slight algebra and makes a formal description of the equilibrium. So what we have is a world where new products x1, x2, xn, are expanding, and at each new round of a new innovation, an old enterprise fails and is taken out of the system. These are created, and the old ones are replaced. Now, at each round, then profits of bunu nasıl yazacağım? Innovators. Spell check. Okay. Burada bir A olacak bir yerde. Tamam. Profits of innovators will depend on mainly three things. One, a markup, that is the profitability parameter. If you recall, under Romer, there was a markup, Romerian markup, for the oligopolist was a share parameter, inverse of their share in total GDP, times the marginal cost. And marginal cost was the interest rate or the rental rate or whatever. Price was not equal to marginal cost. There was a markup at the rate of 1 over alpha. We are going to make a generalization. We are going to simply denote this by some mu. Secondly, the level of activity, output, that's cap X, that's what do you produce in what quantity. And thirdly, since new rivals are always coming in 2019, 2020, 2021, we set up the firm, but we are subject to pressure from upcoming new innovations. So the number of days we remain in business is, from our point of view, subject to what is the rate of growth of innovations that's in line. So we are going to use a third notion, number of days or years, let's say years, the innovator is expected to stay in business. And that we are going to denote by the time index tau. A higher rate of innovation will reduce tau. It will destroy the existing firms, so that the existing innovators' profitability will disappear over time. And each new firm, then let's call this equation 1, profits is simply markup over activity times how much time do you expect to remain in business. A very simple algebraic relationship. The higher the markup, the higher is your profits. The more you expect to remain in business, the more you are going to make profits. And the more you produce, definitely, the more you gain. Very simple relationship. Secondly, the number of new innovations that we are going to denote by N in Schumpeter is using resources at the rate little n. And R is total resources available in our economy. It includes labor devoted to research. It may include other goods and services. Each new innovation utilizes resources at the rate n. Therefore, production is simply whatever is remained elsewhere. This is like in Romer. Remember, under the Romerian setting, we have had labor, and some of it went to produce goods in business. Some of it went to produce research in the research lab. So just like Romerian specification, in Schumpeter we have a similar. We have total resources. Portion N goes to research. The remaining goes to produce output. Out of this, we are going to rewrite the costs of production. The total cost of production, or the average total cost of production of innovation, is simply costs, typically wage costs, times a beta, and beta is unit of resources needed to produce 1 unit of X. Under Romer, if you'll recall, we have assumed it simply equal to 1. One output requires 1 unit of input. Therefore, the input-output coefficient was 1 to 1 because we wanted to get rid of it. Wage cost times the input requirement to produce innovation. That's the cost of it. And if beta is the input requirement, inverse of it, 1 over beta, is simply Romer's productivity. That is the inverse of the input requirement function. Or input requirement is the inverse of the productivity. The more productive you are, the less will be the input required to produce that good. The less productive, the more inputs you will use. So it is simply logical. So under that setting, Okay, let me use this part. Under that setting, the average total cost of innovation will be some function of number of innovations. The more you innovate, innovation is costly. The more innovation, the higher air costs. Likewise, the higher the input requirement, or the lower is the productivity. If you want, use productivity underneath. They are worse. The lower the productivity, the higher will be the costs. Or the higher the input required, the higher will be the costs of the average cost of production. Thirdly, it will depend on your resources, your total expansion of resources. The more resources you have, the lower will be the costs. So it will be a function of these three things: how much you innovate, what is their productivity, and how much resources do you have in your country to innovate. Based on this, you can simply draw a simple diagram. Here you put the number of innovations, and this is our average total cost, and this is expanding in general in N given beta and R, plus negative. So ceteris paribus, for each level of productivity and total supply of resources, there is an upward sloping relationship between the more you innovate, the higher is the average total cost. This is the cost side. That's how innovation is going on. At the background, you can cook up no arbitrage conditions, wages. You can expand this model. You know how to do it, but the main idea is very similar to Romer's until now. Anything unclear on these simple ideas? Anything you want to add? Buyurun.
Can you explain why it's negative in related to research?
Why is average total cost is negative related to resources? Land, capital, labor, the more you have, the more resources you have, the lower will be your costs. That's the idea. The more you are endowed with, blessed with resources, the lower will be the cost of producing innovation. That's a very supply and demand thing. All right, well, what's our problem? The problem is what a new innovator would like to do in economics. Since the very early days you took step into this institution, is the notion that each new entrepreneur will try to produce up to the point where marginal costs of production derived from the cost curve is equated with the expected returns in present value of profits that you expect in the future. We expect profits, but we also discount them in today's prices. We take a present value of the stream of profits that is expected. Costs on this side, now we want to have a notion of the present value of innovation. Well, 1, 2, 3, 5. So you expect to innovate. Expected new blueprints, new ideas. This is like A that over A in Romer. Expected number of new line of research that is hope to be forthcoming is simply productivity, or 1 over beta, times the existing stock of knowledge. That is the expected new number of innovations depend on productivity of the innovation. And what is new innovation? It is some parameter, an input-output function, which was taken as 1 under Romer, times your resource. If you plot this, number of research, expected new information, you get something with gamma, or if you want to use the input requirement function, or 1 over beta, whichever you want to use.
But wasn't R decreasing at the average total cost, so shouldn't it be downward slope? Or it's only unique to that function?
R produces N produces ideas. But you are on the right track. We are going to use that idea. That is the effect of an expansion in R, or simply a big resource base, will reduce the average total cost and will expand N, and therefore we are expecting more innovative research, more ideas to come out. But clearly, a Schumpeterian setting is the expected days that you plan to be in operation. Number of years that the innovator expects to stay in business before creatively distracted. And this is inversely related with the new ideas. This is the conservative character of existing entrepreneurs. They were innovators once, but once in business, they want to keep innovation away. And you can imagine all sorts of stories in democracy, or the lack of it based on this. And Schumpeter's classic is Capitalism, Democracy, and Socialism. That's his 1940s book, where he describes the concept of democracy, the rule of law, the governing bodies, etc., fit in. So let's complete this. So this is simply 1 over gamma n. Therefore, since I am interested in present value, or expected stream of profits, then to be discounted, profits were observed mu x tau, and the expectation is simply mu times x times expected tau, which is mu times x divided by gamma n. Let's call this equation 7. And if you want, we can add gamma 1 minus n times r. So this is x is 1 minus n times r. This is gamma n. Let's leave it this way. I'm replacing x, gamma n, and x is 1 minus n times r. This is our expected profits. And from here on, present value of innovation is simply shall I write T? Okay. Is from 1 through this guy expects to remain in business, or expected tau of 1 over 1 plus r to the power t. I am discounting the profits. Mu 1 minus n times r divided by gamma n. And if you plot this against n and the present value, you observe that this is a downward sloping function where mu, r, beta, and the market interest rate are all ceteris paribus. The higher the number of innovations, the lower is the present value of the income stream in the future. Now let's put all these together. Let's do it this way. Here is our equilibrium. And here, average total cost, which is something of this sort. This thing. Present value of innovation. Present value of innovation. And over here, we are going to put number of new innovations, or simply A dot over A. That's the expected innovations. And as you remember, this is related with N, with something of this sort. So the equilibrium is whenever the present value of the discounted stream of expected profits, present value of innovation, the present value of the discounted value of the stream of expected profits is equated with the costs of innovation. That is our critical rate of new innovations. And this embeds, given the productivity, an expected line of new research. That's the Schumpeterian equilibrium. Saat olarak fena gitmiyoruz. Buçukta bakalım. Eğer otobüsü falan servise yetiştireceksiniz, ben daha buralarda oyalarım ama dersi bitirmiş oluruz. Now, starting from here, you can play around with things like changes in markup, changes in the market rate of return coming from the consumer side. You can embed a consumer here with C that over C, 1 over theta, you know the rule. That R plays roles in both here. So the consumer's behavior towards saving, impatience, being patient, not patient, will clearly affect how the Schumpeterian equilibrium will be resolved. Changes in productivity, definitely with higher changes in productivity, you will have an inward moving with existing level of resources. You will have more research to be produced. These are all parametric. But this is more or less the Schumpeterian setup. Now, first, any comments? All right, look at this function. Written in 1940s, Schumpeterian expected number of new research, new blueprints. In Romanian language, A dot over A is equal to gamma times n, and n is input-output function of resources. By slight change in notation, if you want, use rather than resource, the resource that had been prescribed by Romer, number of researchers. So if you rewrite this again, A dot over A is equal to some gamma, some n, but you can combine the two together, right? Some constants times LA. Take this A to this side. What do you have?
Almost the same thing.
Well, he is asked in an interview whether he has, or how would he place his research with the idea of Schumpeterian destruction. And Paul replies, I cannot understand it because there isn't enough mathematics in it. But that's how science proceeds. Paul Romer's thing is definitely has more sophisticated mathematics, but the main idea that the equilibrium R&D function is very much what we expect from the Schumpeterian framework, but with the constraint that even though researchers, LA, subject to Jones' critique and etc., even if there is an increase in L, or in Schumpeterian terminology, an increase in resource happens, the notion of equilibrium, that the number of monopolies in existence remains stable because the old ones drop out. It puts a boundary on the system. So it doesn't form an explosion of rate of growth. The number of the availability of resources or the availability of human capital had been contracted by the idea of destruction of the existing firms. That's how the stability is maintained.